Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you happenstance in this dialogue with the new Untouchables. My name is Patrick Lovell, and we are recording on Friday, September 12th at approximately 5 p.m. Eastern. And man, what a week it's been. And it's so great to see each and every one of you. I hope you're all healthy. Right to my immediate left is June Carbone, the Rabina Chair of Law, Science, and Technology at the University of Minnesota. So glad you could join us considering school's just started. Below her is the executive director of the Government Accountability Project, Louise Clark, who's been there for a very long time and in the intersection of a lot of important information that I hope we'll have an opportunity to provide more light on. And of course, William K. Black, the consummate, um, I'd say, country's foremost expert from where I'm sitting on all things white collar fraud that comes from a career in the legal profession as well as criminology and, of course, economics. And I think what's had pretty much a grip on the nation's attention for the past 3 days is something that occurred in my backyard with the assassination of a right wing provocateur, Charlie Kirk. And of course, he was involved with Turning Point USA, which was very influential with the youth vote as it relates to all things Trump and what we affectionately call MAGA. But of course, a tragic event. But in terms of what a lot of the dialogue that happened immediately thereafter was political violence and trying to turn down the rhetoric, especially because Bill and June, you both reside in the state of Minnesota, of course, where Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark were gunned down by an assassin several months ago. And I'm sure that in a nation where I think we have approximately 50,000 gun deaths a year, and on the same day that of course Charlie Kirk was shot, we had the tragedy in the same, quite frankly, district that happened in Colorado, that Columbine happened, which of course is telling, and everything that comes from it. And there's so much more to discuss, but I think I just want to leave that for your opening sort of engagement and response to the political climate and how you guys are sort of reacting. And I guess I'll ask the question initially to you, Jim.
Well, first, I want to express my shock and sadness about this. I mean, yes, we can all condemn political violence. My thoughts always go to the children. I mean, Charlie Kirk had two young children, young man, an entire career ahead of him, and it's tragic. It's tragic with Melissa Hortman and her husband. Melissa Hortman was a University of Minnesota grad, a member of the legislature, incredibly respected, again with two children, in this case in their early 20s. But I always feel this intense sadness for the families, and especially children who will be affected by this the rest of their lives. We also live in an era of deliberate partisanship. Not simply we are partisans. Oh, there've always been parties. The founding fathers sought to avoid them. They happened almost immediately. But we didn't always hate each other. Certainly in my youth, my father was a registered Democrat. My mother was a registered Republican. They mostly voted the same way, and they certainly didn't hate each other. Nor did party affiliation have much to do with their views on specific issues. But we live in an era in which fomenting partisanship is part of what the political game is about. And some of what saddens me about the political game, I'm not talking about violence now, I'm talking about the political game, is how many people play to own the other party, to score points, and don't think about the consequences of what is taking place. It is winning, it is not governing that motivates too many of our politicians today. So I feel a great sense of sadness, but I have been, my own research is right now trying to take a look of what the difference is in courts, among judges, among legislators, about the difference between simply ideological differences and grievance. The kind of grievance that says it is more important to defeat the other side than it is to do something useful for the country. And that saddens me enormously.
Well, Lewis, I know this isn't something you probably normally, you know, interact with publicly because it's not really your arena. But I do know, and I think it's very compelling that you're in the belly of the beast in Washington D.C. You've been dealing with Trump's administration for the past 9 months. You've witnessed firsthand that we've seen National Guard, we've seen other police sent from other states. They're supposedly there to clean up crime and everything that goes with it. But we have seen all over the internet examples of police brutality throughout the United States, or at least I have. I mean, it's incredible. And so when this political violence rhetoric and all of the things that we have seen come down the pike and speculation, not to mention the governor of Utah, what he had to say initially, decrying that it was a far left radical, and that ties back, ironically, June, if you think about it, to Mike Lee because of what Mike Lee said in the aftermath, of course, what happened to Melissa Hortman. But the question to you, Louis, especially because your organization is at the forefront of defending democracy through truth and justice for people within the system, embedded in incredibly enormous revelations as it relates to all manner, shape, or form of our government. But lo and behold, several months ago, you guys were the first to the fore, and most of what you guys are involved with winds up on the front page of the New York Times immediately thereafter. But what I'm referring to, and his name is difficult for me to pronounce, so I'll leave it to you to do it, but within context to Emile Beauvais, and Emile or Bouvet, but what happened in the aftermath of the revelation of your whistleblower, that obviously Emile and the Justice Department, based on his direct orders, were to ignore the court's edicts, only to, of course, be then approved to be on the third district court, which is a pathway to the Supreme Court. It's kind of a loaded question, but obviously it's a crazy time. How do you kind of unpack some of that stuff from your perspective?
Well, to start with is that the folks that we represent are as likely to be Republican as Democrat. And in that vein, they basically are not, they are basically not political. And the whistleblowers are not political. And one of the things that has been frightening, at least over the last several years, probably 10 years or more, is how they have gotten attacked. They, like I say, there's probably more likely to be Republican as Democrat. And yet they have been doxxed by who knows? We don't know. But they've had that experience and they've been threatened. And so that's really concerning.
Bill, I don't really have a question other than maybe your reaction to kind of how the dialogue is going at the moment.
Well, I just to add my personal experience and the whistleblowers I've known as well. What you just heard is absolutely right. We're extraordinarily non-political. It's really the typical person would be thrilled, frankly, at this. In my personal case, I'm a Democrat. 5 of the 6 senior elected members of Congress that I blew the whistle on were Democrats. I didn't hesitate for a second. And the 3 colleagues with me at this meeting of the Keating Five that broke this stuff, I worked with very closely for a better part of a decade. To this date, I have no idea what political views, if any, they have. It may seem impossible, but actually, this is the typical way federal government workers proceed. And whistleblowers tend to be an even better subsection of those folks who find, because there's virtually no upside in blowing the whistle, right? And there is a guaranteed, deeply negative downside to all of these things. If I can put my criminology hat on for a moment, having, and I too, I had guns, in my youth, I shot guns, perfectly happy doing that type of thing. I have not on a jihad against gun ownership, um, but it is the leading threat to your kids. If you do have them in the home, secure them, secure the ammunition. Um, if you have older children and they're going through significant psychological pressures, do not give them guns, right? These are things we can all agree on. You don't need a criminologist to tell you, but um, these are horrifically dangerous things. And there is a effect that when there is one of these, you get these disturbed people in other parts of the country who do become copycats and such. So we really need to take seriously gun safety. And that means not just having safes and all those types of things, but there are large numbers of Americans that should not have guns.
Well, I mean, I've always grown up. I'm from Texas originally, so I've always held cowboys in the highest regard, just in terms of being a child growing up in that culture. And have I shot guns? Yeah. Look, when I think about all of this stuff, and this discussion isn't to really go into all of the issues as it relates to the nightmare that we've seen over and over and over. That's just become like almost second nature. That there's a shooting in a school where children are murdered and all of those sorts of things. I mean, it gets to the point where people become numb. But I think the one thing that we really ought to try to assert and get your feedback on, especially you, Bill, at this incredible juncture of the politicization, as what Lewis had said, that really the whistleblowers are truth bearers, are people who are professionals in the system that are bringing light to situations that have gone wrong or rogue or corrupt or whatever the case may be. But here we are in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination, when ironically he was talking about at the moment that he got shot, that trans people were involved, with spiking numbers in deaths relatable, which was ridiculous. But the bottom line is, he made the argument before that we should have less regulation on guns, and that's the price you pay for the freedom for people to have guns, to be able to, I guess, thwart a government that obviously the Constitution maybe didn't fully trust. At least that's the way they interpret it. But the question that I have, and I know it seems like a different sort of methodology to get there, but especially where you're concerned, is regulation. When the system doesn't have common sense regulation and rules and laws that can create proper outcomes, isn't that playing with fire?
Yes, but also it's playing with fire when you demonize opponents with no factual basis, right? In addition to the two Minnesota politician and spouse who died, you have to remember two others were shot, I believe, 7 and 9 times. And, thank God for emergency room doctors. And it's terrible that we have such expertise in our emergency rooms. But also, had the assailant been armed with a high velocity rifle, those two would not have survived even with the greatest of skills. So we don't need military grade weapons. And Mr. Kirk, unfortunately, had said that the price, of freedom was to have mass shootings. I that is so wrong. It's unfortunate, but again, I'll end with June's point. Um, it's going to be obviously terrible for his widow and the kids, and we just do hope for the best possible outcome of coming through this terrible event.
June, you're a student of history, and I think this is my last question that I want to ask as it relates to this, because I want to move on to the stuff that we're a little bit more compositely attuned with, vis-a-vis corruption and whistleblowing and the information that we need to get to the public. But I do want to follow up this because you're a student of history. The Nazis utilized and exploited an execution of one of their officers to justify what would lead to Kristallnacht. Or not, was it Kristallnacht? Or yeah, it was Kristallnacht. Do you care to kind of, because you've been so, I'd say, inspiring with your historic knowledge of the elements that led to World War I, of course, the Great Depression, and World War II, that gave us this sort of body of a country that operated around the integrity of law. But it took great sacrifice to get there. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what I just laid out.
Well, I think Bill is more up on the specific history. Do you want to go into it, Bill?
You're probably thinking of Horst Wessel.
Yeah.
Horst Wessel was a brown shirt. He was quite an evil thug. But he was fighting communists, and they really actually were communists in the streets, and both sides were killing each other. Horst Wessel also, fancied himself as a composer, and so the Horst Wessel song, the Horst Wessel Lied, became essentially co-equal with the German national anthem as a requirement at Nazi rallies and with the troops. And yes, they used the death of this person to help, not necessarily Kristallnacht, but the whole Shoah, the mass murder of the Jews and gays and political opponents and religious dissidents. The Germans killed in the death camps, and of course, Soviet prisoners in particular were murdered at a very high rate. And so Trump has been looking for his Horst Wessel, and he may have found it.
So let me comment a little bit about what we've unlearned. So when you go back and you look, and you have global horror at Nazism, at Stalinism, at the war, at the deaths. And there's a period in the 50s, period with academic discussions, but with political leaders and the takeaways. And some of the takeaways are, first, when you have something driven by ideology and purity, you're on our side or you're the enemy. That mindset. It is stoked first by the authoritarians. But those who oppose the authoritarians are often going to end up in the same place. And it becomes then a question, are you with us or against us? And that's the only question that counts. When you think of the world that way, you shrink the circle. The only people that count are the people who are with you. Anybody who isn't becomes the enemy, becomes not a full citizen, becomes not protected by the laws. And you can see how that sentiment, informs the country. I think something we've forgotten, and something that Charlie Kirk at least spoke about championing, is this idea of free exchange, of the First Amendment. Well, what made free exchange possible in the post-war era is saying, hey, Nazis don't count. You don't have free speech to praise Hitler. We emerged from World War II with free major television channels. And we had the fairness doctrine that limited what was said, so you heard both sides. And what emerged from that is Walter Cronkite as the most trusted man in America. But Walter Cronkite was not allowed, whatever he thought, to say great things about Hitler or to present only one side of the news without presenting the other side. Now, we talk about false equivalence, and I'm not talking about that. I am saying it was agreement on the rules of the road. And one of the things to remember now as we think about these things, and I've been reading a number of the eulogies for Charlie Kirk and have been moved by some of them, people who knew him well. But one of the things about the media environment in which he's in, and this is true for those of us on these podcasts, the mainstream media is the enemy. The alternative news sources are saying we represent the truth. But what it takes for an 18-year-old to take off on TikTok is being offensive, is being outrageous, is being extreme. It is not simply reasoned debate. Reasoned debate is boring. I mean, reasoned debate, those news programs that used to present that are gone. And one of the reasons they're gone is they don't get the ratings of places that are more outrageous. And so what you have is a media environment that encourages more extreme views. David Frum's interview with J.D. Vance, he interviewed him before he went full MAGA. And he described the change. And he said what Vance learned is what it took to get attention was to be outrageous, to be extreme. Whether you believe in the extreme part of it or not, that's what establishes your media presence, but it's also what gets you street cred with very powerful brokers of the current political environment.
Well, a lot of people like to quote Orwell, but Adolf Huxley was more on the money as it relates to your point, as far as some of his writings that I remember. But when you're thinking about, and this, I'm going to bring this back to you in context to some of the other events around the world that really draw two things to light that these ongoing conversations do. One, we're not playing to the algorithm. We're playing to the wisdom of these incredible guests that bring their years and years of brilliance in the trenches of the law to bring you revelations of what's happening and how we need to understand them, because it doesn't exist in a lot of places, quite frankly. But second, we saw South Korea about 2 months ago. Well, maybe it's much longer than that ago, but hold the guy who ran for president who almost did the same as J6 accountable, right? We saw Nepal on fire this past week, presumably for some sort of the country fighting corruption. We saw yesterday Brazil had brought down a judgment of 27 years in prison for Bolsonaro. And I don't know what the actual reality where he is at the moment and how that's going to happen. And I thought it was tremendous that Brazil, of all people, were demonstrating more of a commitment to democracy and holding power to account than we have throughout, the last, I don't know, however many years you want to put it, but specifically since Trump has gotten into office. So, Louis, I'm curious, when you think about those global scenarios in context, obviously, to the role of the Government Accountability Project, can you kind of set the table of what you're seeing?
Well, yeah, I would like to add a positive note, actually, because in the one of the issues, one of the few issues in Congress is basically protecting whistleblowers. Both historically, I mean, there's been 35, actually more, probably a little bit more now, but at least 35 federal laws passed to protect whistleblowers. Every one of them was passed unanimously by both the Republicans and the Democrats. And the same thing is happening now in terms of, there is I mean, Senator Grassley is a leader. He's a very conservative Republican senator, and yet he remains a leader in advancing whistleblower protection. And well, a poll in 2021, so I guess not recent now, but that poll is the only poll I've seen on whistleblowing is 86% of the American public. And they're talking about voters, think there should be strong whistleblower protection. So there are sort of common areas that are emerging, which is support for whistleblowing and what they have to say. And I've certainly noticed that despite the fact that the polling on the American public, at least 6 months ago, was disturbing, I think, in terms of immigration. But now 60% of the American public is supportive of due process for people who are being, essentially deported in this country. So there is, I think, an emerging common, support in areas that would be healthy for us to, continue, obviously, to work on and expand as best we can. And of course, our biggest problem at the moment is we have an administration that is, quite hostile to the idea of being accountable.
Bill, do you want to pick up on that somewhat?
Yeah, I would just say that criminologists are in full agreement. The United States is unique, might not be exactly the right word, but it's closer than anything else in the degree of unanimity of support for whistleblowers by the public.
Right.
And that has translated through with politics. And again, American whistleblowers have shown consistently that it's rarely a partisan activity. The overwhelming norm is that it isn't. It is extremely common that the people who knew about the bad things, after all, were the same party. That's how they had their position and was able to locate it. It isn't just that we have more whistleblowers. We have vastly more, use the word senior, but you could use lots of different words for it. I don't always mean that they're senior in position titles and such, but they are frequently folks who are highly skilled. And that means that in addition to integrity, they just know vastly more. They can bring to a regulator or a prosecutor or Congress or the public much more detailed understanding, much more nuanced understanding. And from a prosecutor standpoint, in particular, the thing that often trips up the really elite white-collar criminals and politicians is that they lie about the documents never existed. And the whistleblower has a copy of the document and knows where there's a repository of information frequently that will also confirm it. That is just, beyond gold from the perspective of elite white-collar prosecutors and for regulators such as myself.
Can you follow up on your sort of comparison and contrast with what we've seen Brazil and South Korea do in comparison to what we're in the midst of?
Yeah, so neither of those was really whistleblowers so much. In South Korea, the head of state attempted a real bona fide classic coup with military vehicles trying to come in and seize power. Something similar happened in Bolivia. and, and they got screwed up because they couldn't drive the larger military vehicles effectively in the roads near the palace. But anyway, what happened is the populace surged. And just super briefly, this is June's expertise, but there's an enormous problem in Japan and Korea, and have phrases for it. The N knows, N like is into the nth power, knows, of people, young people in particular, feeling that life is hopeless and it just happens to them. And Korea is one of those places. But the people found themselves in that moment and said, no, hell no. And they came out in droves. And so it wasn't a whistleblowing situation per se in Korea. In the case of Brazil, it may have been a whistleblower who hasn't been identified. But what they got is that they actually had tapes of phone calls and messages between the chief judge and Bolsonaro, who became the head of state and is the one now under criminal prosecution, who has fled to the United States and given sanctuary, not just sanctuary by President Trump, extortion. We are openly extorting Brazil through our economic power to cease the investigation and any prosecution of Bolsonaro. The Supreme Court judge in Brazil who was corrupt and doing Bolsonaro's bidding, I believe, was prosecuted successfully. I believe he's incarcerated at this time. I'm less sure of that. So again, it's not classic whistleblowing of the part you just heard explained, but yeah, it's a similar sentiment of the public once they learn that the people at the top are violating everything they claimed to stand for, abusing the law, then people often turn on that, even in countries that aren't particularly favorable towards whistleblowers.
Well, June, just to got it to you real quick, and I apologize to insert this question, but I was aware, I didn't effectively ask the question because I wasn't referring to whistleblowers within the context of Brazil. I was comparing the fact that the citizenry and, more importantly, the judiciary was upholding the law as it related to the obviously the overthrow of Bolsonaro. So, in comparison to us, that's kind of what I'm.
Yeah, can I let me, Bill can come back to this, but I'd like to add this point because it ties these things together. So when Lewis was talking about whistleblowing and the support for whistleblowing, one thing he didn't mention is the Supreme Court. So I was taking a look what's happened to employment. And I used to do employment cases for the federal government when I worked for the Justice Department. And it's not the area in which I teach now. But with my last book, I went back and look, what happened to the cases? And the Supreme Court systematically undercutting worker protections, systematically undercutting employment discrimination, systematically undercutting class actions, but not whistleblower protections. The area where the Supreme Court has stood up for employees has been whistleblower cases. And I want to tie their cutting back in those other areas to what makes this era different. And that is that we believed in institutions. The area that, when Henry Ford adopted the family wage, the $5 a day wage in 1914, he did so because there was reported 377% turnover at Ford Motor Company in 1913. But what came out of that was loyalty. Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company, conferred identity, commanded loyalty for its workers. And the management studies of the day, including many at Ford Motor Company, said that loyalty, the identity with the institution, loyalty to its values, is a more effective motivator, creating greater productivity than bonuses, incentives, taking a look at what the share price did yesterday. That idea of a commitment to the values with which the institution is associated with is a very powerful force that confers meaning and motivates whistleblowers. So that what you see are people who have absorbed the ethos in which they're trained. Violating that threatens who they are. And I want to connect this to a couple of things. One is that when you have that, when you have these intermediate institutions that people feel give meaning to their lives, they're also more resistant to the calls of grievance and the calls of radicalism. When I look at the young men, especially those involved in, I would say the school shootings are people committing suicide. But when you look at many of the young men engaged in political assassinations or bombs, and if you think of, if you think of Islamic terrorists, you are talking about young men often coming of age in a society that doesn't give them a purpose or confer meaning. And the openness to radicalization is often, hey, I will be somebody. I will make a difference. I will have an impact. Because right now, what's ahead of for me doesn't do it. Either I'm not being very successful, or what I could be doing seems pretty trivial. And so that idea of meaning, of commitment to the ethos of an institution, to loyalty and identity are very powerful. And it ties together whistleblowers who are motivated to uphold those things with people who believe in the values of a country that, and who feel betrayed by those who are lying to them.
Well, Louis, I'll tie that question into what been the ongoing question about the Supreme Court in the United States versus what we've just seen, particularly in Brazil. But I would also just pick up on what June said with regards to what you guys encounter every day and you have since the late 70s. The Supreme Court, you would think, would have the ultimate loyalty to the actual principles of the United States, to the loyalty to the Constitution, to all of those things that I think most of us believe we are because that's our education. But here we see a situation where it's like even the most basic construct, for example, the imperial presidency, and I could go on and on. But do you find yourself, ever wondering, based on the whistleblowers and the protections and everything else, and the loyalty and the principles that June just kind of conferred, if we're in a new arena, given obviously the Supreme Court's decision making over the course of the last year?
Well, for one thing, that was a beautiful presentation, and quite uplifting and quite accurate as well. The Supreme Court, we took the cases, Robert McLean versus the U.S. and by a 7-2 decision, the court upheld the Whistleblower Protection Act. It was the first time it had been tested and the only time it's been tested. In addition, last year, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the burden of proof in the corporate whistleblower bills, which are without the burden of proof as now exists. Whistleblowers would lose every time. And the Supreme Court recognized that and unanimously upheld the corporate whistleblower laws, and overturned the Second Circuit, which is often thought of as a progressive circuit, but it's also a protector of business. And so it had ruled in adverse to the whistleblower, and the Supreme Court straightened that out. So at least, again, as presented, we are doing well at the Supreme Court, and they have upheld the whistleblower protections that Congress has unanimously, supported. I think that, it might be too hopeful to think that, but I think that with the idea, I think the increasing idea, I'd say the increasing reality, is that the whistleblowers are almost the only oversight left. I mean, the Office of Special Counsel has been gutted. It hasn't been gutted. I'm sorry. The President Trump tried to put in an absolute racist and with no qualifications and into that position, and that's the position that essentially protects, or should, at least its mission is to protect whistleblowers. And that person, the best whistleblower, or the best special counsel in history, was fired, and then his replacement, however, it's one of the nominations that is not making it. It was withdrawn. So that whistleblower office is nevertheless in trouble. The IGs were gutted, or at least fired. And in addition to that, the independence of both the special counsel and the Merit Systems Protection Board, which oversees the justice system for the civil service people, those have been compromised because they used to be independent and now is questionable. So those guardrails have been essentially compromised, but still the whistleblowers are there, and the whistleblowers are being listened to. And I think increasingly, as we see our government essentially dysfunction, and that is growing. There are just waves of people within organizations, EPA, VA, a number of, the FEMA. Most recently, there's letters that are coming out from those agencies of government, signed by hundreds, and in one case, thousands of people, or 1,000 people, employees essentially blowing the whistle through these letters of challenge about what's happening within those agencies. And, and of course, some of those people who signed those letters, at least that have been found out, or they actually signed their name and allowed it to go public. Those people are being put on administrative leave, and some are being fired, but they're fighting back. And so, I would just say that I think the whistleblowers are going to be perhaps canaries in the mine about what's happening within the government, but I think that they're going to prevail.
Louis, can I ask you something? Do you mind,
Yes.
Patrick? So there are, to me, two parts of the story. So the part we hear, the part we see, we occasionally, when we get to hear the whistleblowers, is the consolidation of power on behalf of President Trump. The part that I hear about when I talk to the folks in the trenches are basically optimizing the use of the government to rip off all kinds of people. I listened to Doge, the accounts of what Doge is doing, and I want to know, what is all this information being used to do? Then I interview a union organizer, and I hope it will be on this platform soon, talking about what employers are doing is using that information to sell employees things at jacked up prices. And I'm wondering, we have a new account that I'm sure Bill will want to talk about gutting the protections that involve money laundering. And we know that there are all kinds of accusations connecting Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein to the Russians and money laundering. And those regulations are being eviscerated. And a number of these things are not just about bringing in, MAGA loyalists in place of more neutral civil servants. It's about optimizing corruption. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, are you hearing that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we are hearing that. And also, for example, we do represent essentially one of the leaders in data protection at the Social Security Administration. And just 2 weeks ago, we took his case, New York Times. It was on the front page, and he exposed the fact that 500 million credit cards, that the files behind 500 million credit cards have been essentially whisked. The data has been whisked off into a cloud, and no one knows how it's been manipulated or used, or it might not have been at all. Um, I think I said at one point that it was theft, but it's not. It was, it was. We don't know yet what has happened to that data. But I would just say this is that there is a great deal of concern that the reason that things have been guardrails, I guess, have been gutted is so that some people can benefit financially from this new sort of dystopian government that we're seeing evolve. I think that the seeds of the destruction of the oligarchy are basically possible when these civil servants, who are the vast majority, begin to stand up and be counted in opposition. You can't run an agency with a handful of people. I mean, we're right now we're representing the Voice of America employees, and that agency. There was has been or is a real attempt to gut Voice of America. It's gone from 1,700 journalists to 81, and they're still maintaining that that's still within the. I mean, that's not violating a mandate from Congress, which is ludicrous. But they can operate. They're not operating, and the government has to function. The American people, I don't think, are going to stand for a government that is not only not functioning, but is also just doing nothing more than finding ways of being able to essentially enhance the wealth and power of the elite and elite.
Wow. And we're running out of time, Bill, but thank you, June, for bringing up what I wanted to get to earlier. And we're going to have to table it till later because, and I'll just say this without, looking for a dissertation, Bill, but the nature of the front page article of our friend, somebody I've interacted with who apologized that he couldn't appear with us today, a gentleman by the name of David Enrich, who is the lead business editor of the New York Times, who alongside two other crack journalists, finally tell the story of JP Morgan Chase as it relates to Epstein. Now, what I just heard Louise convey was an actual hope that the only way to plant the seeds of the destruction for the oligarchs that have hijacked the government, sorry to sound a little bit maybe too transparent, but is in the whistleblowers. Okay, so I don't know. We've only got 8 minutes left if you want to maybe share what's important to you at the moment.
Yeah, so a friendly amendment on what Louis just said. Yes, that's the tremendous problem where the government no longer functions in vital functions. But the government is likely to function in the way they intend when they create the sovereign wealth fund and all the crypto. And that will be horrific. So I'll just leave you with this brief thing. Examples are very common, and you'll know this from the con, where the underlying fraud in the business operation is relatively small. And the corporation reports losses, right? Because they're not able to inflate the income all that radically. But the stock price goes like this. These are pump and dump schemes. They are endemic in crypto, but they're not limited to crypto. So one of these corporations, it was a Chinese one in this case, had these 2 years of operations. It had lost money in both, but its stock price had gone up 6,000%. The money from fraud, the profit, is not in the operation of the corporation typically. It's in inflating the financial numbers and ripping off through finance and accounting. All right. And in particular, You want to create this bubble mentality in a get-rich-quick scheme, which is to say, if you're going to have a sovereign wealth fund by potentially billions, maybe many more, maybe tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in crypto, well, what will happen to the price of crypto? It will go up massively, and then they'll sell at the peak. So I fear when the government does function under Trump in these operations that they're going to get together, because these things are going to be run by people who have a corrupt interest, direct corrupt interest in the stake. And I fear that they'll be quite effective, and that it will be even worse than some areas where they're ineffective. Although, again, I don't want to understate in any way where they're ineffective. What Louis is saying, what we're saying in criminology is this kills people, right? When the government doesn't do the things it's essential for the government to do, yes, it's vast amounts of money are lost, but people's lives are lost as well. And people's lives are maimed even when they aren't killed. And that we are just one natural disaster away, given the destruction of FEMA. And by the way, many of the states also being eviscerated before we're going to have human catastrophe on scales that bring us back to places like Galveston.
And
Oh,
go ahead.
yeah, it's not just that. I mean, we are dismantling everything that works. Social Security is perhaps the best symbol of that. Republicans have been trying to kill Social Security since it started. Why? Because it works. And what they're doing with what they started to do with Doge is to make it less responsive, less efficient, more susceptible to fraud. I want to come back, though, to this idea of groups and what we're not investigating. So when you look at Jeffrey Epstein, there's pressure about the sex, and he destroyed lives, and that should be investigated. But the real conspiracies are the financial ones. So I do want to connect these efforts to gut the mandatory reporting that gives you clues about money laundering. What are the red flags all over the bank accounts associated with Epstein? Money laundering. What has Donald Trump been consistently accused of? Money laundering. What was the fallout, at least according to the biographer, between Epstein and Trump about? Uh, it's about buying a property that Trump then flipped and sold to Russian oligarchs in a manner that says money laundering all over it. It has all the characteristics. We don't know what happened to that mandatory reporting. The banks reported a lot of it. Um, Paul was talking about that in a prior podcast, and we don't know what happened. Some of the people in some of the banks associated with Jeffrey Epstein had to resign because of affiliation with the sex part. But what about the financial part? That's another area where there could be whistleblowers, there could be investigations. Some of this isn't so long ago, but some of it has been out there and never really explored for decades.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen. And I'm going to bring this to you, Louis, to close, because again, to that point, because I want to ask you a pointed question, but I just got to say that in the description below, I'll put the ICIJ's investigative International Consortium of Investigative Journalists piece that came out 3 years ago on the suspicious activity reports through the FinCEN files. Extraordinary piece of information, unbelievable journalism from none other, Bill, than the great Michael Hudson, the journalist who wrote the Monster. Okay, but I guess the question, considering what June just said, to close us out here, Louis, considering what just appeared on the front page of the New York Times, for the first time in the entire story's history that I'm aware of. And I've been reading the New York Times for some time, but I know this didn't slip my awareness because I've been involved with the con for a very long time. And I would have noticed that Jamie Dimon was being groomed to be the Treasury Secretary under the Obama administration, while this guy Staley was being groomed to be chairman, and Staley was the guy that was responsible for the Epstein relationship. So, Louis, just out of curiosity, do you know anybody who's a whistleblower from Chase?
No, no, but would love to have that opportunity. So, if any of your listeners, would want to contact us, that would be great. I will say this is I think that one of the things that needs to happen in the investigation of financial fraud and money laundering and the entire universe of financial corruption is that you have to have impact to get more whistleblowers coming forward. And as Bill well knows, is the whistleblowers in the savings alone had a huge impact because they were able to have impact. So there were more and more of them, and they ended up sending 1,000 and more people to jail. Then when the banking crisis, much higher stakes, much more powerful people involved on the corruption side, and very little happened that should have happened because the whistleblowers were not able to have the impact they needed to have. And part of having an impact is essentially having the American people support these people and essentially rise up in their defense. That has to happen.
And they have to understand the story, which is what we've been doing the entire time.
Yeah.
And the reason why the New Untouchables project exists. And I am so grateful for your participation, Louis. June, thank you. Bill Black, we're out of time. I will encourage everybody to take a look at the descriptions below. I'll have links to the Government Accountability Project. If you are a whistleblower from Chase, want people to know, reach out to me. I have friends that you need to talk to. But please, everyone, check out the con at thecon.tv. Please follow our work at thenewontouchables.com, and also check out the Clean New Deal at thecleannewdeal.org. On behalf of liberty and justice for all, onwards and upwards, truth must prevail. Thank you, guys. All the best.
Okay. Thank you much. Bye-bye.